Hi, my name is Ben Engel and I'm from the Canton FFA chapter. We're here with Rita Grafe of the Pasto Ag Museum. So Rita, what is the Pasto Ag Museum?
We are a collection of agricultural and rural life tools and technology. We focus on how work was done in the farm and on the home up through the 1930s. And we focus on how the work was done using muscle power, animal and human power before gasoline engines and electrification.
Thank you, Rita. My name is Ben Engel and I'm from the Canton FFA chapter. I'm here at the Pasto Ag Museum with Larry Harpster.
Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about small grains here, I guess. Actually, that's one of the oldest of the agricultural endeavors that goes back, I wouldn't say prehistoric, but when somebody decided to stop hunting and gathering and start to cultivate some ground, small grains was probably one of the earliest ones around. We do have some samples here of small grains that are raised in Pennsylvania. Wheat, rye, oats, barley, buckwheat. All those grains are pretty commonly raised here in Pennsylvania. In the beginning, they believed that the wild oats and so forth and other types of grains that they harvest, they just went out and picked the grains off of it. And of course, that was a pretty long time consuming job. So one of the first implements that the early farmers came up with, of course, was a sickle to cut the grain in order to harvest it. And then they had some use for the straw also, and not only animal bedding, but some other things. The oldest thing we have in this museum by far is this clay sickle. And it's about, goes back to about 4000 BC, so it's almost 6,000 years old. As the Metal Ages came along, bronze, and then later iron, of course, they started making the blades out of those metals. And finally, we got the steel. And this was a pretty long time consuming thing to harvest grains with. The grain hook, the one on the top there, was actually the common thing used for hundreds of years to harvest grain with. Somebody figured out, and probably a guy with a bad back, that, you know, if we put a longer handle on this thing, we don't have to bend over all day long. So that we can go ahead and cut it. And the scythe came along, probably somewhere around the 1600s. And then a little later, then the curved type of scythe came along, made the thing a lot easier to handle. After the grain was cut with these things, generally, sometimes the wife and kids came along and bundled it together, and then it was hauled into some central place to thrash. The gathering together was either done by hand or with some early rakes. Another smart guy figured out, you know, if we kind of combine the rake and the scythe, we could come up with a way in which to put the grain into piles. And that's where the grain cradle came from. It's a little vague as to when the cradle actually came about, but it became popular into the late 1700s. Probably started in Europe, probably in the 1600s, and then of course was brought to this country. A little interesting sidelight. These are four-fingered cradles here. If you find one in Pennsylvania, the Northeast, it's probably a four-fingered one. If you go to New England, it's probably a five-fingered one. I don't know why that was, but it just is kind of custom. So anyways, the grain cradle, you could cut the grain, then you bring it back with the grain laying on the cradle fingers here and put it into a nice pile, so that you didn't have to go around and gather it all together. All right, once the grain was harvested and taken into the field, then of course it had to be thrashed. And that is to remove the grain from the stalk, the piece of straw, and get rid of all the coverings, the chaff. A common thing that was used is the grain flail, and you would just spread the cut grain out on a hard surface, take that club contraption there and just beat it until it would separate all the grain out. Then you had a mess, okay, because you had the straw, you had all the chaff, the hulls and so forth. So you had to separate it a little bit further. Removing the straw wasn't too much of a problem, but getting rid of all the chaff was another problem. So what they would do was sweep it up into that wooden contraption up there, which is a winnowing tray. And you had to wait till a nice windy day and stand outside of the barn door there and toss it up and down while the wind was blowing, and that would blow the chaff away. Somebody back in about the mid-1800s figured that we could come up with a machine so we didn't have to wait for windy days. And basically the windmill came along. A fan, of course, made artificial wind. You throw the grain and chaff and everything in there. This fan then blows the light stuff out. The heavier stuff goes down into the bottom tray there. And that saved an awful lot of work. A lot of people were trying to mechanize grain cutting. Those guys up there could cover about 1.5 acres to 2 acres a day if they really knew what they were doing and had a good crew coming along binding the grain. And they didn't use twine, they just took a couple of bands of straw and tied it up. And we have one sitting over there that you can take a look at, which is done by hand binding. So starting in the 1700s, there was quite a push, particularly in Europe, to come up with some kind of mechanized way so that you could get more than a couple acres done a day. Cyrus McCormick, which was one of the founders of International Harvester, actually perfected this thing, and it worked pretty well by 1831. Now, his was not the only one, but he was the one that actually made it a paying proposition. And if you take a look at this model, there was one horse there in the shafts that was pulled. A guy walked behind it, and as the reel came around, the grain was cut by that blade and laid onto the table. The rakeman then had to rake it off into bundles. Now, 2 or 3 guys at a couple acres a day went to about 12 acres a day on a really good day. So an immense, increase in production. Starting in about the 1850s, the reaper kind of evolved into this. This actually is a little later one. This is after 1913. But this one is of the type, and it's called a self-raking reaper. And if you watch the operation of this thing, that reel goes up, that one goes up, that one comes along and rakes the grain off. So we put the rakeman out of business, okay? One guy with 2 horses could cover on a neighborhood of about 12-15 acres a day with this. You still had to have a crew coming along and tie it up into bundles. And that's a backbreaking job, because even if in nice even pounds like it is out of this thing, you still have to come along and tie it up. Then you have to shock it, put it into piles in the field, let it dry for a while, and then load it up and haul it into the barn. There was quite a number of different things and people trying to come up with a self-binding reaper. Wire was kind of popular for about 10 years, but if you don't get all the wire out of it, it winds up in animal feed, and the cattle get hardware disease, and the millers really didn't like it because it messed up their nice big grinding wheels. So that kind of faded away. You've all heard of McCormick Deering, I'm sure. Deering was actually the man that came up and kind of perfected the twine. There were other people that developed a knotter and this mechanism, but Deering actually is pretty much responsible for getting the industry to have the twine. Believe me, this thing is not much good unless you have baler or binder twine to put in it. So that whole thing had to be organized before these things really became too successful. Everybody calls these things a binder. I guess technically it's a self-binding reaper. This one actually, this one was made, I think, or sold at least in 1937. And until after World War II, into the early 50s, this was pretty much the common way, at least in Pennsylvania, that grain was harvested. This thing was pulled by at least 2 horses in that direction. The reel again cuts the grain and pulls onto this canvas elevator. It's elevated up here to the packing end of the machine. These fingers pack it. As the bundle gets bigger and bigger, it puts pressure on this. Eventually that trips. Needle comes up through and goes to the knotter. We were figuring one day here during Ag Progress Days what you could go out there and find that's still in this museum. That knotter is one of them. Okay, that's almost identical to the knotters that you'll find on a small square baler these days, even yet. This was actually perfected about late 1860s, early 1870s. There was some improvements done to it, and basically all the binders that were sold had to pay patent rights to a guy by the name Percy or something like that, I think was his name. But that's pretty much unchanged as far as the knotter goes. It ties the bundles, of course, automatically. This is called a sheaf carrier, and once you get 4 or 5 or 6, how many ever you want to put in, the guy up there hits that pedal to the left, that thing goes down to the ground, and all the sheaves are in a nice top. One of our volunteers went over to Amish area and took these pictures. As the binder goes through the field, it leaves them in rows like that. Or if these guys apparently didn't have much of a sheaf carrier, they should be pretty much in a pile. The next crew comes along and puts them in the sheaves. They sit out in the field like so here for a week, 2 weeks, or depending on how much rain you get. Then they come along with a wagon, horse and wagon, and load them up and haul them into the barn. The thrashing machine, of course, and there was all kinds of ways that they thrashed grain, other than the flail. The flail was kind of the common thing on the small farms. George Washington and some of the other more aristocratic farmers had threshing floors, and they would drive horses or ponies around over top of the wheat or oats or whatever they were thrashing. And once they figured they had everything separated, then they had to go in and take the straw out and put it into the windmill. This machine here was made in Fleetwood, Pennsylvania. You're probably not old enough, most of you, to remember Fleetwood Cadillacs, but that's where the name came from. There was a body shop there which General Motors took over, and for many, many years, Cadillac made a Fleetwood. This has a metal cylinder in it with spikes on it. That actually knocks the grain off. The whole business goes on through here, fan down at the bottom, so it's kind of a combination of the thrasher and the windmill. The heavier grain works its way down through the bottom here. The light stuff, some of it's blown out with a straw, some of it comes out this particular tube here, and the heavy grain comes out this one. This has straw walkers on it, very similar to your combine. This one actually has an elevator, most of them did, so that you could make a straw stack outside of your barn or wherever you were running them out. This is a stationary machine. You may have seen them at shows or fairs or whatever. They got a lot bigger and they got much more portable. They were mounted on 4 wheels. Early, they were run by steam engines. Ours, of course, is run by a horse treadle. And you get a horse on there and he walks and turns the big wheels and belts there. And that's what operates this thing. They had some bigger ones, and they also had treadmills which had 2 horses, 3 horses wide. They really needed a lot of power. Once the steam engine came along, and once the smaller gas tractors came along, treadmills were kind of out the door. Actually, International Harvester, McCormick Deering, made these things, I was surprised to find, clear up until 1955. But it was pretty much the common way. By 1955, most everybody was into the smaller combines. Later, of course, the combines got a lot bigger and were self-propelled. Massey Harris actually had one of the first combines self-propelled combines in 1940. And it was a huge monstrosity of a thing. During World War II, there was such a shortage of labor. Massey Harris got a contract to build 500 of their Model 21A, I think it was. And in 1944, if you would guarantee that you would do 2,000 acres, they'd sell you a combine. And that was what was known as the Harvest Brigade. And that really did an awful lot to increase the popularity of self-propelled combines. And of course, after World War II, John Deere and Gleaner and everybody else got into building combines. Anything else you need to know?
All right, thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm Laura Watkins from the Canton FFA chapter, and I'm here with Larry Harpster, a volunteer at the Pasto Ag Museum.
Okay. Basically, these levers mostly control 2 things. Number 1 is the height of the cutting table here and the height of the reel. In very tall grain, you would want to pull this lever back, and that elevates the reel up, like if you were in rye or something. If you bought grains, particularly if the weather isn't too good or real short, you would want that reel down almost onto the cutter head. The other thing is, of course, the table height brings it up and down also. This pedal here controls the sheaf carrier, and whoever was running this thing had to look out there, and when you got 5 or 6 sheaves on there, enough to make a shock, you would hit that pedal, that thing would drop, and the 5 or 6 sheaves would be in a pile, and then the next crew would come along then and put them up into a little stack, which is called a shock. While you're up there, you also have to drive the horses too. So generally it was a set of lines coming back. A lot of guys put the lines around their back of their neck, so they had their hands free. The horses, the ones that run this thing, got onto it pretty good, and they really didn't have to have much guidance. So. Okay.